As drug wars have raged across Latin America, the region has suffered almost unimaginable levels of violence.
Over 27,000 have disappeared. Previously exhumed mass graves pepper the hills. It stinks of death up here.
Over the past 20 years, over 2 million people have been killed, as cartels have made billions.
What was once produced in the back of camper vans is now produced in huge quantities and makes huge profits for the cartels.
I'm J.S. Raffaelli. I've spent years writing about drugs, why people take them, and why our governments chose to declare war on them. At Vice, we make a lot of films about drugs, but in this show, I get to dig a bit deeper. I get to talk to fellow expert drug nerds about their research into the crazy world of mind-altering substances.
We're here on the western wing of the prison. You can start seeing the numbers of people and the overcrowding here, which is quite considerable.
Joan Grillo is a journalist who spent the last 20 years reporting on the drug war in Latin America. He spent time with sicarios and cartel leaders from northern Mexico to the ghettos of Jamaica and El Salvador. He's joining us today to explore how drugs and drug policy have fundamentally reshaped the region in shocking ways. Hi, Joan. Thanks so much for joining us. So how does a writer from Brighton, England, end up spending 2 decades chasing around the drug wars of Latin America?
In 2004 to 5, I was working for the Houston Chronicle, a Texas newspaper, and I was covering the border between the city of Nuevo Laredo, Mexico, and Laredo, Texas. Now this, at that time, was really the beginning of the current Mexican drug war, which really exploded across the country. Then you start seeing some crazy stuff there, these houses with like 30 people tied up and kidnapped. You start to see the mass graves. At the beginning, they were like, a house with 15 bodies was a big deal. Later on, it would be like fields with 298 bodies. So that was the first stage, 2004 to 2005. In 2006, December 2006, you saw Felipe Calderon become president, and he launched his military crackdown on drug cartels, and I was covering that. You suddenly saw the real explosion of the body count really taking off, the level of weaponry really taking off. And one scene there, which I remember very clearly, which is kind of a wake-up call to me. I went to this town called El Pozo, right up outside of Culiacan, Sinaloa, and there'd been 2 massacres there. We went just after the second massacre there, and there was still all the bullets laid out. Everybody hadn't even cleaned up the scene. And a bunch of the residents of this village, this place, were all leaving in a convoy of like pickup trucks, just taking their stuff, leaving. It's just like refugees leaving this place. And that was like this vision of that was like, wow, this is going to destabilize the country. I found myself by 2012 in a morgue in Monterrey with 49 bodies who had all been decapitated, all had their hands and feet cut off. The stench of death, and like, what the hell am I covering? What am I following here?
Actually, about you as a journalist, reporting on the narco wars in Latin America is actually extremely dangerous for journalists. Have you ever felt in real danger yourself, and sort of what do you do to stay safe in that?
Yeah, obviously I've felt in danger many times. I think any journalist covering this has and does. There's many situations. So there's the more obvious violent situations, like being in shootouts, being with security forces during raids, or being where there's like armed criminal gunmen moving around, or in these areas. But there's also always this kind of paranoia. But sure, there's been a whole bunch of episodes that have happened over the years, including one time where I was accused of being a DEA agent, and this guy said if he saw me again, he'd put a bullet in my head. The level of violence against so many local journalists has been so bad, and that we've seen perhaps 150 Mexican journalists who have been murdered since 2000. I knew personally, 2 of them.
And you've also gone beyond Mexico, right? You've been to places like Honduras, Brazil, Jamaica. I'm curious about the common threads, and I suppose also the sort of different nuances of how the drug trade plays out in each of these places and how it shapes the societies there.
they call them favelas in Brazil, they call them the garrisons in Jamaica, they call them comunas in Colombia. But these kind of poor, marginalized areas, which often where they've been kind of set aside, they haven't had all the benefits of society and this kind of modernization or a lot of the industrialization. They've kind of been on the margins. But at the same time, they've built up their own structures. And I see organized crime and the drug cartels in some way being a kind of organized power groups coming out of a lot of the deprived and poor communities. You see control of territory, and they have, spies who watch people coming in and out. In Mexico, they call them halcones or hawks. In Central America, they often call them postes, like posts. In Brazil, they call them like vapors, these guys who are like there will disappear. So you have these people having that same kind of role. You have more of the violent arm, the trigger men, the paramilitary groups, again, who have different names around, but they often have that common. Some places they call them soldiers. Others, in Mexico, they call them sicarios. But they have that same role, the kind of muscle. You have these financial elements in the business, which can, not just about drugs. Drugs are a huge thing, but also in Mexico, particularly, you see a diversification of organized crime. So you see them involved in stealing crude oil, running human smuggling, running prostitution, extortion, kidnapping, piracy, wildcat mining, and a whole bunch of economic activities.
One of the things I actually most wanted to touch on is this idea of political corruption, which is obviously super key to the whole discussion around the drug wars in Latin America and the Caribbean, and how this sort of plays out in different ways in different places.
Now, Jamaica is one of the places where you really see the political story in a very, very big way, because in Jamaica, the gangs in Jamaica, or the posses in Jamaica, were in many ways founded by this link to political parties and this idea of delivering votes to political parties. But then you see that same practice in many places. In Central America, you see, like in Honduras, in El Salvador, you see the gangs which control neighborhoods can then deliver the votes en masse to political parties in exchange for certain things. Now, Mexico is a kind of a basket case of corruption. You had this cop called, his nickname was El Tyson in Michoacan. He was a state police commander. And when he was eventually arrested and gave a confession, which they aired on TV, but like he was saying, well, yeah, I was, actually a ranking cartel member, actually not just a regular on the payroll, but a ranking cartel operative, who was not only carrying out horrific murders for the cartel, but training youngsters and getting young recruits in the cartel to lose their fear of blood. So he would describe how he would get the young recruits and get them to cut up bodies and get them to lose their kind of fear of blood and stuff. It's like that's what he was doing, and that's a police commander.
But some of the kids doing this, right, they're doing this from a very, very young age. This is like 13, 14-year-olds committing murder or acts of extreme violence, right? Pretty much across the region. How are these children being recruited, and what's their career progression up the cartel hierarchy?
There was one guy from the Barrio Azteca in Ciudad Juarez I interviewed, and he was talking about how they look for the young people who are going to be good murderers, and it's often people who have got hurt inside them, who haven't got really stable families, people who have got a lot of violent impulses. There's one guy I knew in Honduras, whose nickname was Fresa, who was one of these guys on one side a nice guy, on the other side a very, very violent sicario. And he was abandoned as a kid, and he had this real, he told this to me, he had a real kind of hate inside, like, I've had a shit life. How come, I've got to take this out? I don't care if I'm going to mess you up. He ended up himself being murdered. And leaving his own kids fatherless, and he was kind of looking for his kids not to be fatherless. So you see this repeating in that way. Once you've committed multiple murders, and sometimes I talk to kids who are 13 and have already committed double murders and that kind of thing, and it's like, well, it's very hard to bring them back from that.
And I think we need to get a real sense of the scale of this, right? In Latin America, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of casualties every year, mass graves, refugees. This is beginning to look like warfare. And where does one draw the line between criminality and war here?
So well, this is a weird place between crime and war. And it's kind of somewhere between. That's why I use the word crime wars sometimes.
And then what you also get is the gangster warlords in very poor areas sort of taking over the role which the state fails to do, sometimes providing sort of almost social services in a very haphazard, basic way, but attaining this kind of Robin Hood folk hero sort of status within these communities.
And you see these, the kind of gangster warlords themselves, the real kind of top figures, become these weird kind of between rock stars and criminal CEOs and paramilitary leaders. And you see that as well. I mean, Dada's Coke celebrated in songs, including by some very big dancehall and reggae artists. The same as in Mexico. The drug lords celebrated in soap operas, in telenovelas, these stars of music, stars of culture, and the way they kind of have these kind of anti-hero role in societies you see as well right across the continent.
So where are all the weapons that these various gangs and cartels are using? Where are they coming from?
So the cartels get their guns from various sources, but in Mexico, the biggest source by all evidence is the United States. So the US, as well as having the biggest drug consumption market in the world, also has the biggest retail gun market in the world by far. You see more guns in civilian hands in the United States than the next 25 countries combined. And as well as a legal retail market, you see a parallel black market in guns in the US. So you see guns moving from that legal market to the black market by various ways. And the cartels, we're right here in Mexico, right next to the US, are using that massively. So we know there's been like about 160,000 firearms taken from criminals in Mexico over the last 12 years and definitively traced to gun sellers and gun factories in the United States. But that's only the ones that are being captured, and the real number, estimates of more than 2 million guns being trafficked over the last decade. So like really on a substantial scale, real big issue. This is a historic case of firearms trafficking from the United States to a very, very violent war zone, or a very, very violent hybrid armed conflict, I would call this. And right now we've got the situation where the Mexican government is suing the US gun companies over this. It's a long shot, but they are, have now forced the gun companies to hire lawyers and to go to court to try and respond to this challenge.
And people associate Latin America with being the route from South America to the United States, which is the world's biggest drug market. We know that. I think a lot of people don't mention or don't talk about actually how the domestic drug consumption along those routes, right? People don't know that like Brazil is the second largest consumer of cocaine in the world. Have you seen that change and shift over your time there?
There's been certainly a rise in drug consumption in Latin America. This happened before I arrived here. I think you first saw like a big rise going up from the 90s. But it's very natural. One thing that happens, and this is the logic of drug economics or narco economics, is that people will often pay somebody, instead of paying them in cash, they'll pay them in drugs. So they're like, it would be cheaper for them and it's better for the person who receives it. So if you say, what do you want? I can either give you 20 grand or a key of cocaine, and that key of cocaine, you can bounce that and then like make 50 grand out of it. Now, some of the cartels in some areas actually don't allow in Mexico the selling of crystal meth, because they crystal meth is a bad, and especially the type of crystal meth they're producing these days is a bad drug, and that they don't want their own base of people. They don't want their own sicarios and their own like halcones taking cocaine. Taking crystal meth. They're okay with them taking cocaine. Cocaine use, you see, one of the funny things is in rural Mexico, in the northwest, you see a lot of old guys taking cocaine. I was up there recently, and there was like an 80-year-old guy who was still like taking cocaine off a key in the local shop, which is kind of like the local corner shop. You can just go in there and just say, "Can I have some, cocaine, please?" And they'll bring out a little, drawer and kind of, bring out these different types of cocaine.
Your time in Latin America has coincided with the opioid crisis in the United States. Did that change the shape of the market?
And the issue when you have synthetic drugs, that whereas the traditional bases of plant-based drugs were in certain areas, so the Andean region for cocaine, heroin, particularly the Sierra Madre in Mexico, marijuana, these certain mountainous areas. These labs can be anywhere. So you can find labs in the cities, in outskirts, right by the border, all over the place. These labs where they're cooking up synthetic drugs. 2
questions. Is there a solution for this that you can see? And what do you see the kind of short to medium term future of this trade being?
In all of my books, I always try to put these solutions, and it's interesting when I talk to people often who live really who grew up in this, they're a lot more cynical about it. So I'm like, you come, and it's often the question people ask, and people I think in the UK, in the US, in Europe are more like, these are problems we can solve. And you talk to somebody who grows up in a favela or grows up in these really hardcore areas and been involved in this, and they're like, just the way things are, you've got to make the best of it for yourself in this situation. However, I do always emphasize 3 areas for solutions. First, there's no magic bullet. It's not like, there's a silver bullet and like bang, this all goes away. But the 3 areas I look at, one is drug policy reform. It's like saying, I think, really moving global drug policy, American drug policy and Latin American drug policy to say, we haven't been able to stop the drug trade. We have to look for harm reduction. What drugs can you legalize and take this away from being a very, very bloodthirsty gangster market? How can we reduce addiction? This kind of thing. The second is, how do you actually build justice systems in these areas? How do you build police forces that work? And, I grew up in the UK, being anti-police, or, seeing, when I was a teenager, I thought, all police were scum or whatever, and then you realize, okay, go to a place where really there's no police force that's functioning, and go to a place where people kidnap someone's kid and sends a video to them saying, I've got your kid here kidnapped and I'm going to beat the crap out of them until you pay me some money, and see what that's like. And you start to realize, how bad things are. And actually it's not that there's no police in this area. Sometimes the police are pulled out of this area, so the gangsters become the police. And they offer a pretty brutal, justice system like we talked about. Or you have really corrupt, violent police. So how do you build some justice system which functions and which is, really serves people and helps community? A third area is like, how do you change these people who are recruited into this, who have very few options? How do you change that? So there's been some interesting people around, from a guy who was mayor of Medellin, and he said, I see it's like a mathematical problem. The people in the poorest areas need to have the best services. How do you change and transform these areas? How do you give people a better stake in society? And the idea that people aren't going to become, mass murdering, serial killing sicarios, but are going to want a different path in life.